Everyone thinks real-time settlement fails because the rails aren't ready. They're wrong. The real choke point is the machinery inside the banks, the part no one ever sees. Core systems built in the 1970s, batch windows that freeze money every night, netting engines that can't survive instant finality. If you want to understand why adoption looks slow, you have to go inside the machine. From the outside, it looks like global payments are already instant. Retail apps show completed in seconds. On-chain transfers settle in a handful of blocks. And headlines promise real-time everything. But if you follow those transactions into the interior of a bank, the story changes. Beneath the app layer and the messaging networks, most of the world's money still runs on systems that only truly update state once or twice a day. That's the paradox driving this episode. We have external rails that can move value at near real time, but the machines that actually decide when a bank's money is available, when capital is at risk, and when positions are final, are still operating on a daily clock. The world thinks the bottleneck is the network. In reality, the bottleneck is the interior. Everything here is for educational and entertainment purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If clear, no hype crypto education helps you make sense of all this. Hit like and subscribe. It tells YouTube this series is worth showing to other newcomers, and it helps me keep building it for you. So, in part 2 of How Ripple is Rebuilding Global Finance, we're going to stay entirely inside the bank. We'll look at how core systems actually run, why batch windows still rule, how intraday liquidity and netting models depend on delay, and why a new interior clearing fabric, including architectures like Yellow, is becoming the missing upgrade that prepares banks for the external rails we'll cover in part 3. If you strip away the user interface and the mobile app, a bank is ultimately a collection of ledgers and engines. The core banking system tracks deposits, loans, cards, internal accounts, and ledger balances. Around it sit risk systems, treasury platforms, compliance tools, and reporting engines. Most of these components were designed in an era when the safest assumption was that nothing needed to be updated more than a few times a day. A lot of the code at the heart of these systems is still written in languages like COBOL and runs on mainframes that have been tuned and battle-tested for decades. That isn't a meme. It's a rational choice. These systems rarely fail. Regulators understand how they behave, and every internal process in the bank is built around their operating rhythm. When you ask a bank to move to real-time settlement, you're not just asking it to change a payment rail. You're asking it to change how its entire operating system keeps time. That operating system doesn't just update balances. It coordinates when fees are posted, when interest accrues, when overdrafts are recognized, and when downstream systems can trust that a number is final. Until that core changes its rhythm, everything else in the bank has to respect the old metronome. At the center of that rhythm is the batch window. Every bank has one. It is the period, usually overnight, when the institution pauses certain front-end activity, runs its posting cycles, reconciles internal ledgers, and prepares for the next business day. The batch window is when today's activity becomes tomorrow's ground truth. This batch logic is wired into more than just IT. It underpins accounting, risk management, and regulatory reporting. If a bank miscalculates during that window, the errors propagate everywhere: capital ratios, liquidity reports, even the numbers regulators see. So the batch window is protected, guarded, and extremely conservative. Real-time settlement doesn't just narrow that window. It questions whether the window should exist at all. If balances can change every second, posting cycles can't be batched once a night. If reconciliation is continuous, the concept of a single end of day starts to blur. That's why banks can't simply turn on instant rails and call it done. The moment they do, they have to confront a basic question. How do you run a batch-era institution in a world that never stops? Underneath the batch window is another fragile layer: intraday liquidity. A bank doesn't have one pool of money that everything draws from. It has positions in central bank accounts, nostro accounts with correspondent banks, collateral posted against various obligations, and liquidity buffers that must be maintained to satisfy regulators and internal policies. Right now, those positions move in a semi-predictable way. Payments are initiated during the day, but many only settle and post fully during clearing cycles. Treasury desks can forecast their needs, maintain buffers, and adjust intraday with some breathing room. They know that finality is delayed, and their models are built around that delay. Real-time settlement removes that breathing room. Once a payment is final in seconds, liquidity is consumed in seconds. If the bank's internal models, data feeds, and rebalancing tools aren't synchronized at that speed, the institution risks falling below its internal or regulatory liquidity thresholds. That is not a hypothetical risk. For a regulated bank, it is an existential one. This is why treasurers are cautious. Instant rails that outpace intraday liquidity management are not an upgrade. They are a potential failure point. Another invisible piece of this machinery is netting. Banks, clearinghouses, and payment systems don't settle every transaction individually. They aggregate flows, offset debits against credits, and only move the net difference. Netting dramatically reduces the amount of liquidity needed to support a given volume of payments. It is one of the reasons large value payment systems can function at scale. These netting engines are deeply tied to the idea of deferred finality. If you know you have hours until settlement, you can let a lot of activity accumulate, compress it, and settle the net. Your working capital model is built on the assumption that gross flows can be tamed into manageable nets over the day. The moment you move to true real-time finality, that assumption breaks. Transactions settle before they can be netted. Liquidity requirements rise. Capital efficiency falls. For a bank already operating under tight leverage and capital rules, that is a non-trivial problem. Unless netting itself becomes programmable and continuous, real-time settlement looks less like an efficiency gain and more like an expensive luxury. Even if you solve netting, you still have to deal with fragmentation. Treasury operations are rarely housed in a single unified system. Cash management, FX exposures, securities positions, collateral, and derivatives may all live in separate platforms, with their own data models and refresh cycles. Reconciliation stitches these worlds together. Internal ledgers are compared to external records, discrepancies are investigated, and differences are resolved. Traditionally, this happens in a handful of cycles per day, with a heavy emphasis on overnight runs. The process is designed for a world where being wrong for a few hours is acceptable, as long as you are correct by close of business. In a real-time environment, that tolerance vanishes. If balances are moving constantly and settlement is final within seconds, reconciliation cannot be a back-office sweep. It has to be built into the fabric of the system. Every mismatch becomes a risk event, not an item for tomorrow's exception queue. That implies a completely different architecture: continuous data feeds, shared state across treasury systems, and an interior platform that keeps all those views aligned. This is why simply wiring a bank into an instant network rarely works at scale. The external rail may be capable of real-time movement, but the internal state machine is still designed for batches, nets, and reconciliations that assume time to think. When those two worlds collide, the bank has three unappealing options. It can throttle usage of the real-time rail to narrow corridors and controlled volumes. It can overallocate liquidity and capital to compensate for its inability to net and reconcile continuously. Or it can accept a higher level of operational and regulatory risk. None of these are long-term solutions. They all confirm the same underlying truth. Without an internal upgrade, instant rails and legacy cores will always feel misaligned. So the question becomes, what kind of interior architecture would allow a bank to enjoy real-time settlement without tearing out its core systems or destabilizing its balance sheet. The answer many institutions are converging on is an intermediate layer, an interior clearing fabric that sits between the external rails and the legacy core. Instead of forcing the core to see every movement in real time, this fabric maintains a high-speed, high-fidelity view of positions, liquidity, and obligations, and then synchronizes with the core in a controlled, programmable way. Think of it as a continuous state engine for the bank's obligations. It can track streams of payments, apply programmable netting logic, manage intraday collateral, and feed real-time views to treasury and risk teams. Crucially, it can also present a more modern interface to external networks, speaking their language and cadence while insulating the core from shock. This interior fabric doesn't eliminate the batch window overnight, but it starts to shrink the distance between daily cycles and continuous operation. It gives the bank a place to experiment with real-time flows, refine its models, and gradually move more activity into a world where finality is measured in seconds, not days. Yellow Network is an early example of how that fabric might look when it is built with state channels and programmable clearing at its core. Instead of pushing every transaction through a shared ledger immediately, Yellow aggregates flows inside secure channels, updates balances at high frequency, and only commits the necessary settlement steps to slower layers when required. Inside a bank, an architecture like this can function as a programmable netting and clearing engine. It can support multi-party flows, apply rules about when and how positions are settled, and expose real-time views of exposure without forcing the legacy core to process every micro-movement. For treasurers and risk managers, that opens a path to real-time responsiveness without losing the control that batch-era systems provide. The key idea is not that Yellow replaces the bank's core, or that it competes with external settlement networks. It operates in the middle. It is an interior upgrade that lets banks modernize their clearing logic, synchronize liquidity across fragments, and gradually raise their operating tempo to match the rails they will plug into. When you zoom out, the pattern becomes clear. The biggest obstacle to real-time settlement is not a lack of external technology. It is the fact that banks are still running an interior operating system built on batch windows, deferred netting, and fragmented reconciliation. That system has served them well for decades, but it cannot fully coexist with a world where value moves continuously. Interior clearing fabrics and state channel architectures, like Yellow, point toward a realistic migration path. They respect the constraints of today's cores while building the foundation for tomorrow's real-time environment. Once that interior layer is in place, banks can finally make full use of the external rails that have been developing in parallel. In our next video, we shift from the inside of banks to the global settlement rails Ripple has already built, the institutional stack powering the new financial system. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. This channel is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and is not financial advice. Always do your own research and keep the discussion respectful. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with a friend.